This video is about costs. In the previous chapter, we talked about if you know a production function, you can map out isoquants, which show you all the possible combinations of inputs that result in the same production. And of course, the producer would like to, in general, produce as much as possible, but we know that the producer will have some sort of constraint. So in this chapter, chapter 7, we'll be talking about that constraint on the producer side, which is the costs of input, or in general, the cost of production. All right, so we start out by talking about just a general definition of accounting costs versus economic costs. Accounting costs are just costs that you actually pay. Economic costs could also include opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are not necessarily actually paid. They could be what you're giving up. You could also be gaining something. So opportunity costs could be positive costs, or they could be negative costs, things that you're gaining. We say just in general in economics, we'll consider both opportunity costs and the accounting costs that you actually pay. So if you see a problem on like the MyLab homework or quiz about this, it'll just be asking about accounting costs or costs actually paid, and then economic costs would be accounting costs that you actually pay, plus opportunity costs, positive or negative. Right. Our total cost of production, we can break down into a part of it that's fixed and a part of it that's variable. So fixed cost isn't going to vary with the level of output. And the way we often think about fixed cost is like a factory, right? So the example here is a steel mill. Before we start producing any steel, we have to build the factory, and that's our fixed cost. And no matter how much steel we built that factory, and it costs some amount of money that was fixed. And then a variable cost is a cost that varies as output varies. So once we've built our steel factory, if we want to start producing steel, we're going to need some sort of ore, and then we're going to need some laborers, other things. This would be our variable cost, right? So as we produce more steel, things that we need more of are variable. Right, so just some quick definitions. Again, we're looking at marginal and average. So when you think about the marginal anything, we're just asking what happens for a unit change. So the marginal cost here is asking, if we produce one more unit, how much extra is that going to cost us? So the change in total cost when we change quantity. All right. Again, I think the best strategy in this course is not to try to think of these as like equations that you have to memorize, but more try to think about the definitions in words. Anytime that we've seen a marginal anything, we've calculated that by taking the derivative of some function with respect to a variable. That's what we're doing again. So, back in chapter 3, we talked about marginal utilities. We would take the derivative of utility with respect to the variable to see, one of the goods, to see if we consume more of one of the goods, how much extra utility do we get? Here, again, we're asking about the change. So we're asking, if we have some function that describes our total costs, how does that function change if we increase our quantity or if we produce more? Right, so marginal anything, no matter what it is going to be the derivative of some function with respect to a variable, what we're changing. Here we're asking, how does the cost change as we produce more stuff? So the marginal cost is the derivative of total cost with respect to the quantity. Right, we also have average cost. So if we wanted to know on average how much each one costs to produce, we can just divide our total cost by quantity. If, for example, we produce 10 units and it costs us 100, what's the average total cost? Well, our total cost was 100. We produced 10 units, so our average total cost, each one cost us 100 divided by 10, or 10 on average. Right, and because total cost can be broken down into fixed and variable cost, we can just divide all of this by Q. We know that average total cost is average fixed plus average variable Here's our average fixed cost. Here's our average variable. Again, we've just divided this whole equation by Q to get an average per unit. All right, in the short run, in the previous chapter, we talked about how these inputs, one input at least, would be fixed. And then in the long run, all inputs would be variable. So let's consider the impact of that. Let's assume for now capital is fixed, right? We have just a set factory or we have a set plot of land. So if we want to produce more, it's going to cost us more to produce. We're going to have to hire more inputs to produce more output. What can we hire? We can't hire more capital, that's fixed. We can hire more labor. So when we want to produce more, it will cost us more. We have to hire some workers who are paid a wage, W, and this is just how many more we hire. All right, so what's the change in our cost, the change in our variable cost in this case? We know that when we hire more people or produce more quantity, our fixed cost doesn't change, it's fixed. What's the change in variable cost when we hire more workers? Well, suppose each worker costs $500 a day. We hire 3 of them. We now have an increased cost of $1,500 per day. That would be the change of our variable cost. Right, the marginal cost then is, if capital is fixed, again, we're working in the short run just for now. So if capital were fixed, marginal cost would be just the change in your labor costs, because capital costs aren't changing when we change quantity. Right, this would also be the same as our derivative of total cost. It's just that capital is fixed, so it's all gonna, the only thing marginal is changes in labor. All right, we'll revisit this graph for the most part in the next chapter when we talk about optimal choices for the producer. But it turns out, we're graphing out just if we have some sort of total cost, and we can know our fixed cost, which doesn't change when we add more output. The rest of it is variable cost. So then we can map out the averages, and we can also see our marginal cost, which is how does total cost change when we increase quantity. So just by assumption, we're going to assume that these are all the same in every industry, and you won't be really responsible for like creating graphs that look like this. Instead, we'll be kind of using it for more interpretation, and especially in the next chapter. So we'll kind of revisit this in the next chapter, because these average total cost and average variable cost end up being calculations that we need in order to determine whether a firm is going to produce 0 or a positive quantity. We'll look at variable cost, and then the decision to enter or exit a market will be this average total cost. All right, so that's just looking ahead at kind of why we are taking this time to specify these average totals and kind of map it out. Again, the point here isn't going to be to actually create this graph, but to be able to interpret it in the next chapter. So the assumption here is basically that as we increase our output, our costs might decrease for a little while, but our costs can't decrease forever. If it eventually costs 0 or next to 0 to produce, we would produce infinity, and we know that that's not a realistic case. So at some point, our costs are going to start increasing. That's what we're seeing here. So the averages start increasing. Right, our last topic in this chapter, I'm going to kind of skip ahead through these long run costs. I see depreciation and interest as kind of more of a 304 topic, intermediate macro. But ultimately what we're doing here is just deriving a cost constraint or an ISO cost line. So what's our total cost of production? Well, we know that we're using labor and capital to produce. how much does each cost? We pay labor, our wage W, we pay capital, this rental rate R, and then this sort of preceding section, which I'm skipping over, just sort of derives, what is this rental rate R? What we'll mostly be doing working with this is being able to map out an ISO cost line like a consumer's budget constraint, and then putting the previous chapter and this chapter together. If we know the consumer's production function and can map out those isoquants, the producer wants to get to the highest possible isoquant given some ISO cost or given some total cost constraint of hiring labor and capital. What is the highest isoquant or the highest level of production the producer can reach?